So some quick organizational announcements before we get started. We are closing out the year, so I'll do a little give a little of your year-end giving to the Urbanist pitch just to get us started. We are a small organization, but we think we have a big impact, and we do that through our readers, spreading the word, and also working with great partners like Futurewise, who we have tonight. So you can see the donate button on the website or email me if you have any questions. We also take donations analog style via mail. But yeah, your support goes a long way. So with that housekeeping underway, the other thing we wanted to highlight is next month we're going to be talking about the I-135, and that will be on the ballot in February. So it's a good timing. So sign up for that one if you're interested. Should be a good chat. We'll have How's Our Neighbors there. Tiffany McCoy, the leader of that group, has really been doing a ton of work on that and has really brought folks together. So should be a good talk. If you have any lingering questions about that, you can get them answered before your ballot comes in the mail. And we also have book club next month, so check that out. Ray's put together a talk with the author will be there, Angela Lange. I think I said that right, hopefully. And it's a Meet Me at the Fountain, a book about mall architecture. So watch out for that. So those are kind of the events happening. And now let's get to the main event. We have Bryce Yadon and Marcella Buser. Did I say those names right, guys? Sorry, not. Pretty close. And Bryce is Government Affairs Director at Futurewise. Sorry, I was spotlighting myself. And is a longtime veteran in Olympia. It's been, advocating there a long time. And Marcella is a new statewide organizer for Futurewise. So they're going to be teaming up to, put this legislation that we're supporting. I think we're still calling it Washington Can't Wait. Put that stuff in a good position this year. We're getting it piece by piece. Washington is waiting a little bit on some of it, but we are thinking that the wait might finally be over this year, hopefully, on some big housing stuff. We're excited to have Marcella aboard and Bryce coming back to really twist some arms in Olympia and hopefully bring together a really good coalition. So with that, they have a presentation to start, and then I've compiled some of your questions. Feel free to add more in the chat, but I will be moderating the questions. So please be respectful of our speakers, and we'll mute folks if they're not cooperating with that. But take it away for your presentation, and then we'll get into Q&A.
Awesome. Thanks a lot. And thanks everybody for giving us the opportunity to present today. I'm going to run through a few slides for folks. A lot of this is you're going to know because I know you guys know a lot of the stuff that we've been working on. And I also just want to extend my thanks for all the work that you, the Urbanist, and all the folks who volunteer and give hours to them for the work you've done over the last few years. We've had some significant wins, and if it wasn't for our partnerships with folks like the Urbanist, we would not be nearly as successful as we are. And I would say over the last 2 years, we've had some of the biggest impacts and changes to the GMA, and we look to continue to grow that. So I'm going to run through a few quick slides and then hand it over to Marcella to talk a little bit about the campaign. And what we're calling it this year. It's a slightly different thing, and we'll go from there. So really quickly, I'm not going to read through this slide. We are bringing back the climate GMA bill. I think the big pieces to recognize this year is the bill is fundamentally going to be the same. A couple of tweaks. There's going to be 13 counties instead of 10. We've added Skagit, which has actually already indicated that they want to do this work. Grays Harbor and Grant County and Yakima. So actually like 4, but we're still tweaking the numbers on exactly who's in and out. Yakima and Grant coming in because they are extremely fast growing, and then Grays because of the impacts that they have with sea level rise and some of their growth that they see occurring. And then everybody else has to do, all GMA planning counties have to do the resiliency piece. Nothing new. I think the big things I wanted to share with folks today is that it's going to be a governor request bill. So we've got the full weight of him. And the good news about that is that tomorrow during the budget release, we're going to see direct allocation for funding of the climate element. This includes $27.5 million for implementation, an additional 10 million for people or counties and cities voluntarily doing it, and then an additional 4.5 million for implementation from state agencies. So we're sitting in the realm of almost 40, around $40 million a biennium for a very big bill that we've been advocating for a number of years. So this is big news, and it's going to go a long way in helping out. The big stuff we want to work on this year, just a little bit of background on housing. I know I talked to you a number of years ago about House Bill 1220, which updated the Growth Management Act, housing policy goals and outcomes. For those who might not have been following it that quickly, there's a number of significant changes, but one of them was a housing needs assessment that the Department of Commerce will be doing for every county across the state, and those are going to be the housing needs numbers that they have to strive for in their comprehensive planning. So we're actually going to get bigger numbers, and the numbers I'm showing you on this slide here are preliminary, but these are what Department of Commerce has released. And the Central Puget Sound alone has over 600,000 units of housing needed over the next 20 years. The Central Puget Sound has to accommodate 600,000 new units. Of those, over 300,000 below 50% AMI. And I bring these numbers to folks just so we can kind of understand. We've always known there's a problem. We've always known that we've been underproducing because of the cost of housing, but we're starting to see better numbers coming out. And so these are going to be finalized in the next few weeks and sent out to every jurisdiction. So just letting people know to keep their eyes on that. But PSRC has a heavy lift, and it's going to be this way in every jurisdiction in the state moving forward. So aside from climate, our big push this year, and it's picking up where other organizations and partners have been doing it for a number of years, is refocusing on housing. And addressing housing at all income levels. So we kind of divided it up into 3 different buckets. There's the supply side, which is really to address the prevention of development of housing within urban growth boundaries. This includes, any zoning or development regulations, as well as cost drivers like parking and other things. We really need to start addressing those, and we think we need to do it at a statewide level. And in addition, it's address the issues that slow or unnecessarily delay the creation or building of housing. Think about certain types of design review or unnecessary appeals that just slow projects or zoning changes or development regulations down. And this is going to manifest itself in 2 pieces of legislation that I'll talk to you about in a minute, but I want to just set this up. The second is stability. In the update to the housing element, all jurisdictions are required to implement anti-displacement policies. And all cities should start addressing that. And we need to see additional opportunities and legislation that would diversify our ability and kind of give a lot more freedom for those, for innovative or different types of anti-displacement policies. In addition, as always, renters need to make sure that we're adequately providing protections to renters for unnecessary evictions or things like making sure that things are fixed on time, and just overall making sure that renters aren't being gouged or mishandled from property owners. And then the third piece is subsidy. It's really trying to figure out, we need new revenue sources at the local and state level to address this large housing need that we have. And to the finer point on all of that, it's, we need to see an investment of at least 400 million in the Housing Trust Fund. I know that AWC, the Association of Washington Cities, and others, looking at the numbers I showed you on the previous slide, are asking for about $1 billion a biennium. So there's a big number hanging out there for everybody, and that's going to be a key component. Really quickly getting into maybe the more important pieces of legislation before us. As I mentioned, on the supply side, there's 2 pieces of legislation that Futurewise is going to be focused on, that we're helping organize statewide on, and we're helping lead a group of lobbyists in Olympia, and that's the middle housing bill. It's been around. Representative Bateman is introducing it again, and my understanding is Senator Cooter will have the companion in the Senate. And there are changes. If you guys remember House Bill 1782 from last year, it started off in a good place, and then it kind of went to a bad place and never recovered. And so we're starting from a good place this year. We've changed the population thresholds. It's all cities over 6,000, or any city within a contiguous UGA with a city above 200,000. This gets at places like Newcastle and others that are, were below that 20,000 mark last year, but are a part of the, urban center of places like Seattle and King County. It addresses a number of cities in Pierce County and others, and making sure we're hitting that. There's going to be a minimum of 4 units per lot across the entire city that is subject to this. And then there's an additional 2 if you're within a half a mile of transit. And I want to flag that this is only in there if zoning isn't already higher around certain types of transit. This is not meant to be a TOD bill. And to be honest, if we get a strong enough TOD bill, this second piece that I just mentioned should become pointless. And that would be a goal of ours at the end of the day. The other thing that I did want to flag for people is that a new thing that we've been working on to include is 6 units per lot all over the city if 2 of them are affordable. So we're working on language. This is similar to what they do in the Portland metro area and portions of Austin. It's really just trying to get that bonus. It also helps both for long-term affordability and great organizations like Habitat that can then leverage additional resources and make those go farther. Development regulations can't be any more restrictive than single family. So that means everything that you apply to single family is applied to the middle housing. And as we know, there's a lot less regulations for middle housing. And the reason why we want to make sure is we're not distinguishing it is that we don't think there should be additional setbacks or other requirements for middle housing that aren't applied to single family, detached single family. So that's going to be a big piece. They must follow development regulations on critical areas and stormwater. So if there are limitations on the property because of critical areas, you might be able to only get 3 units on that property. That's fine. It's the critical areas. It's not unnecessary development regulations. And we're also looking at and refining language around what does it mean to have partial implementation of an update to the housing element. As I mentioned, there's a number of pieces to that. One of them is anti-displacement. The other is undoing racially disparate impacts and land use and zoning. And this really kind of fits within undoing some of those harms. So seeing how we can apply it to specific areas to actually lower the cost of implementation for 1220. So that's the middle housing bill. I can answer questions in a minute on more of that stuff. We're just kind of trying to work out additional kinks, and hopefully Representative Bateman will introduce the bill in the next couple of weeks and go from there. The second bill that we're really going to be focused on is a transit-oriented development bill. And really, the main key components of that is that it's supposed to be complementary to the middle housing bill. And as I mentioned before, if there's a way to really focus the TOD and get rid of that extra half a mile language within the middle housing bill, that would be preferable to most people. But really what the TOD bill would be is going to require minimum allowable densities around different types of transit. And this is going to be flexible enough. So if a jurisdiction does it by, say, units per acre, That's how they can, we'll have a minimum threshold for units per acre. If they do it on, FAR, we'll do minimum FAR requirements. If they have anything else, the bill is really supposed to get at the flexibility that local jurisdictions have. But instead of saying, here's what you must do, the bill itself is just going to set floors for how much has to be allowed at each transit station and what it looks like. There's going to be different types of transit based off of a transit study that was done by the Transportation Committee last year. So things like light rail will have higher densities, and then things like frequent transit that might only be 15 minutes or every 30 minutes will have different levels of density requirements, but they will be higher than most minimums that are out there today. And it would allow for SEPA safe harbor for development regulation changes, obviously. That bill is going to be introduced by Senator Leas. We're still working out some details and getting feedback to him right now. So I don't have much more to share on that one, but as it becomes available, we'll make sure to get it out to folks. That, I think the goal is to introduce it by the second week of session. As they've already kind of worked on a timeline to push it through committees. The goal is to just move it through the Transportation Committee and try and avoid Ways and Means if we can. So it'll be interesting to see if that works with how they've written the bill. Really, I've mentioned these before, so I'm not going to go over them extensively, but we're trying to address the outcomes that we have: exclusion, high housing prices, reduce infrastructure costs, reduce sprawl, reduce transportation costs. In addition to housing, these are all the things that we need to be doing to really achieve both our climate goals, but also our housing goals. And then I'm going to turn it over to Marcella for a second to kind of walk into some of the messaging and some of the next steps we have on the campaign today. And because I think we do have a new name, correct, Marcella?
Yeah, we do have a new name. If it was still Washington Can't Wait, I feel like it would be Washington Still Waiting. So can't really do that anymore. But our new campaign is called For Our Future. The idea is we are fighting for our climate, for our communities, for our children, all of these issues, transit, housing, climate, these all come together if we are going to build a Washington that we actually want to live in for the next few decades. So yeah, thank you, Bryce, for going over all of those bills and the issues. But what can we do about it? There's a lot. We've got less than a month until the session actually starts. And this is a really great opportunity for us to, one, educate everyone on these issues and on these solutions, but also start building visibility and building the buzz around these issues. So for our campaign, we are meeting every other week on Tuesdays. And then we are going to be meeting every Tuesday once session starts. But if you are interested in getting involved, we are looking for more volunteers. I just put a link in the chat. This week, we are smack dab in the middle of our first December week of action. So we have been taking actions every single day. Yesterday, we did a letter to the editor writing party, and I think we submitted about a dozen letters to the editor across the state, hopefully some to the Urbanist, so you should check that out. And tomorrow, we're doing a storytelling training. We've got in-person postcard parties. We've got a lot of great stuff going on this week. So if you're interested and you want to join in on any of those events, or you just want to stay up to date on what we're working on, you should fill out that form I just put in the chat. And then I don't have the link up right at this exact second, but you can check out our blog on our website to see more about our week of action events. On Thursday, we've got our in-person event. It's going to be somewhere in Seattle. I don't know exactly, but we're going to be writing postcards together and then mailing them to our legislators. And you can write about why you care about all those issues or one of those particular issues. But we are looking for folks to get involved, or if you are part of an organization that you want to help out, you should still fill out that form and I can reach out to you. And I will get that blog post link in a second. That's all I've got about the campaign.
Thanks. Oh, we can't hear you.
And we can share that around as well. We'll both on the post and future posts. So we'll make sure it gets out there. Well, anything more to add, either of you, before we jump into questions?
No, I think that I just want to, again, acknowledge the work that you've all done. We are creating a large campaign. We also have on the ground lobbyists, and we've teamed up with the labor, both SEIU and the State Labor Council. We're working closely with the Seattle Metro Chamber of Commerce. We're working with our partners in Sightline, who started a lot of this work, and then worked with us over the interim to get us to take on a portion of it. AARP, the Sierra Club. So we continue to grow out what this housing and climate campaign looks like, both from an institutional standpoint, but also a grassroots standpoint, as Marcella said. So I think I can leave it at that. I just wanted to flag that we have some pretty major partners that have stepped up on the housing front that maybe have been more disorganized than previously, and we're hoping we can get them all moving together.
Great, and that sort of segues into what I wanted to start our conversation with, and we want. I think there's quite a bit of optimism going into the session, but at the same time, I kind of wanted to start by dissecting sort of what the heck happened, what went wrong last session. I know you and I had chatted shortly after they, pulled the gavel, and we were kind of commiserating and looking at our wounds, but kind of walk us through that again now that you've had more perspective. Some of the big bills we were following in addition to the missing middle bill, which we discussed, was also the climate element to the Growth Management Act, which was 1699, which would have forced climate planning. But kind of that one is the one that died at the doorstep. But what happened, Bryce?
Yeah, so we'll start with 1099 and the GMA climate bill real quick. And I gotta say that I haven't worked on a bill in the last week of session as hard as I did that bill, and I can tell you that every email and every volunteer outreach that occurred changed the course of the bill and helped out. But essentially what occurred is we realized that once we got the bill to the Senate floor originally, we couldn't kind of get it over the hump. The Republicans offered an amendment that really gutted it and just turned it into a resiliency bill and kind of got rid of all the greenhouse gas emission reductions and vehicle miles traveled reduction requirements. The bill then ended up going into conference, which the two chambers then meet and try and discuss if they come to a compromise. We reached what we believe to be a pretty good compromise, but there's some processes that you have to go through when you do what's called a conference report. And one of those things is the bill has to sit for 24 hours before it can be brought up for a vote. And so based off of a couple of mistakes made early in the process, the transmittal occurred about 4 hours later than we thought it was to what's called the bars or the rostrum in both chambers. So to begin with, 3 days out, we lost about 4 hours of game time. I know this is getting kind of minutia, but this is how important it was. So we lost about 4 hours. We couldn't bring it up until about 3 o'clock the following day. And that 3 o'clock the following day coincided with the second to last day of session. But at the same time, there was a challenge to the new bill by the Senate Republicans that had to be ruled on by Lieutenant Governor Denny Heck. And that was just the addition of language around a rebate for local jurisdictions and some other changes that were made to get to an agreement. The Republicans argued that it was a new bill and that it shouldn't be applied directly to it. There's a bunch of rules in the handbook on why you can't do certain things. It took Denny Heck, Denny Heck took that 24 hours after the ruling, after the challenge occurred, and wrote up a ruling in connection with the governor's office, Futurewise, and some of our other partners. And then, as I mentioned, at 3 o'clock on the last day of session, they could run the bill. At that point, the Senate was congratulating those folks that were retiring. So then we lost another 2 hours, and the Senate didn't vote on the bill until 5 o'clock. And at this point, we have to adjourn by 11:59 on the last day of session. At 5 o'clock, the bill got voted on. It passed the Senate. The House was supposed to reconvene by 5:30, and they ended up not reconvening until 8:30, and they had a budget that was going to take 3 hours to run, and then they had to pass 1099, and there was one other bill. Republicans slowed everything down and took all 3 hours on the budget, and that's why 1099 ended up dying on the last day of session. So, because
it's a bunch of procedural kind of nonsense, but it
Yeah,
all
it
matters in the
was.
last day.
but it was also just, again, a lot of respect for the Dems for moving it, and it was a heavy lift, don't get me wrong, but there was just a few, counting errors on how much time was left that was made that we could have accounted for, and we didn't. And I thought, from a lobbyist perspective, some of the blame falls on my shoulders because I kept thinking it was going to be fine and they're coming back. I can't get them to reconvene, obviously, but we lost 3 hours of floor time when they didn't come back from dinner, and so some of that falls on how we organize around making sure they understand the importance of bills. But it was accidental procedural stuff, so it was a bummer. But I do want to reiterate that the bill functionally that we're introducing this year is the same for the most part. There's going to be some tweaks. There's more counties. We know we have the votes. We got 2 additional votes in the House and 1 additional vote in the Senate. The numbers are there. It's just a matter of managing the floor time and managing them moving the bill as quickly as possible.
And you're referring to new members headed in, or have you convinced some new folks?
Oh, mainly just the new members that are coming in, like Shoemake in the Senate will vote for it. So that's an additional vote in the Senate that we didn't have before. And just the numbers in the House, we never had concerns in the House to begin with. We have a good buffer over there, but the D's picked up a seat or two. And that's always helpful too, right? And so
and a happy retirement to Representative Steve Kirby.
Yep.
He has a nice home to retire in, so congrats to him. Some of us are still working on it. That's good news. And so it really was close. So that's when you run into all that friction, when you're a voter too close. Someone, being out to lunch or whatever, suddenly you have to put everything on pause. Well, that's good to know, because sometimes the end of the session, you're like, was that even close? Like, some bills die pretty early or quietly, and we were close. So that is that feels reassuring, and hopefully all the stars align for none of these hurdles to get thrown up. But the other thing I wanted to bring out from that conversation and sort of analysis we did shortly out thereafter, and we won't bore you with this too much longer, but one thing you kind of conveyed to me was that sometimes you can kind of I guess sort of be a victim of your other success, in that you got the vesting loophole passed, which was a good win for growth management. Like, if we're going to have growth management, we actually wanted to mean something, not be very cheatable, in that you can just build something and ask for forgiveness later, even if it's really bad sprawl. So that got passed, and that sort of caused some folks to be angry at you, and that sort of, some of that procedural hurdles getting hit. I don't know if that was strategic or just bad luck, but there were people actively trying to slow up the work, sort of as retribution. So
and I think that's a good point, just so people can kind of see how things happen. As I mentioned, Futurewise has been pretty fortunate in passing some big changes. Housing element one a couple of years ago, last year vesting, and for those who don't know, it's the sprawl loophole that we've had, that Futurewise has tried to pass since 2008, and we finally got it over the line to kind of think about how long a very monotonous bill can take. And there was some frustration from organizations who probably would have let and maybe not fiddled around with as many of our other bills. But I can tell you, folks like the realtors and the counties, that was their number one. The vesting bill was their number one kill bill. And when the writing hit the wall that we were going to get that one, I think it kind of shifted their focus to try and, like we all do, is inflict pains in other ways in Olympia. And I do think, some of the procedural hurdles came out from, realtors opposing our climate bill, opposing the vesting bill, and others. And since the vesting bill passed, they were trying to find other ways to slow down some of our success. But the good news is we still got 10 million. All 4 counties took money to start implementing it voluntarily, the climate bill. And at the same time, we're going to come back and pass it this year. So they delayed the inevitable by a year, but we're still going to win in the end.
Awesome. And last thing I kind of pull out of last session is are they planning to bring back the backyard cottage bill, or that sort of become redundant if you do get missing middle passed?
Yeah, so there'll be, I need to be honest that we just went quickly over like the number 1 big priorities that we're going to focus on organizing. Had a good conversation. There's still going to be an ADU bill, a backyard cottage bill that needs to get passed. In the context of housing, well, I mentioned like 5 or 6 general bills. I would anticipate 10 to 20 are going to have a real chance of passing, and that's one of them.
Yeah, and that's good. That was sort of our litmus test for like where is missing metal at, is if you can't support backyard cottages, it's a bad sign for going a little bit further with missing middle. So that if you go back and look at some of those articles, we pull out some of the names of folks who are against it, and it sounds like we might not necessarily need some of those folks, but if they're your legislator, you can always put in the good word and try to see if you can convince them to change their vote. We never got to the floor vote on 1782. Sorry if I get these numbers wrong. I already got one wrong. So that one's right. But I said 1699 earlier and I meant 1099. So I don't know why you use numbers, but there's enough bills. There's no good way to really to do it. So 7 legislators ended up voting against it, which was enough for that to pass. But then backyard cottage ended up not making it through the Senate. There's always something, and it had passed previously, so it's sort of one of those things we go, I don't know what happened, but so that could be back. That could also be a nice little addition, since a lot of jurisdictions don't even have a backyard cottage provision, including like Bellevue, for example. So something, at least the one that's very buildable. But let's move on to some more hopeful looking ahead stuff. So we kind of talked in broad strokes. We're gonna be mobilizing our followers, both of our organizations. But is there anything else? And we think we have the votes, but is there anything else you kind of want to share with folks about the strategy to get zoning reform over the top statewide? What kind of conversations, what kind of behind the scenes stuff strategically are you hoping that happens?
So I think the first one, and they voted on it last night, and I haven't seen anything come over my email, but then again, I'm way behind on emails. And so on the House side, they have changed jurisdiction of committees, and jurisdiction means where bills go. So last year, the housing land use bills went to local gov, and Representative Paulette was chair. This year, all housing bills, even if they're land use related for the most part, are going to go to the housing committee that is going to be chaired by Representative Strom Peterson, who passed House Bill 1220 in the update, a strong supporter of middle housing, a strong supporter of ADUs, strong on renter protections. He's had the bill for a number of years. So I want to flag that the strategy's just changed fundamentally internally with the caucus dynamics of moving where the bill's going to go. Number 2 on that committee is Representative-elect Emily Alvarado. Some people might remember her from her days at Seattle, the City of Seattle Housing, and the work she did around affordable housing for years. It's really exciting to see her in that role. I think she's going to bring a lot of passion, and again, she has a good view on housing. So that's the first one. The committee makeup as a whole is a really good makeup. We have Representative Bateman on it and a few others. I can't remember all of them off the top of my head, but they'll be public soon, and we'll make sure to get those out. Representative Dewar got chair of local gov, so they ended up removing Representative Paulette. That means things like the climate bill, House Bill 1090, or previously 1099, we don't know what the number is going to be this year, will go to her committee, and she'll have a lot of control over that, which is really exciting. It has gone to environment, but now that we have stronger and better chairs in places, or at least different chairs. Everybody brings a different type of experience, and it's just different chairs. I don't know if any of them are necessarily weak. I don't want to be part of that, but Representative Dewar will have that bill. She'll have a lot of the land use bills and enviro bills that don't go to the Senate or the House Environment Committee. So, I put that out there because some of the strategy has changed. We're going to have different members that we want to focus on. I also think that, secondarily to all of this, there's a big coalition on the ground behind the scenes that are working on, getting five to 10 Republicans in the House to vote for a middle housing bill and making sure they're organized behind it and keeping the bill clean, and doing the same in the Senate with getting 2 or 3 Senate Republicans to vote for the bill. So strategy wise, it's we need everybody. We know we're going to lose votes on both sides in both chambers. So we need to pick up additional ones as we go along. And the strategy is different in that. So I would say that, with our climate bill, we're Dem focused. With our housing legislation, we're looking for most of that to be bipartisan. And so conversations with Republicans are going to be very important from a strategic standpoint, externally as well as internally.
Yeah, and Marcella, I'd be interested in your thoughts as well as kind of from the organizer's perspective. We're talking about behind the scenes stuff, but when organizers, sometimes we're just convincing both legislators, but also just like random people, like, hey, support this, email here, legislator. What kind of messages are you finding that really resonate? And like, how do you break this kind of wonky issue down in a way that's an average person who isn't immersed in this stuff like we are to kind of get it? And sometimes you're hearing pushback about neighborhood character and other things like that. How do you kind of respond to that type of thing?
Yeah, well, one thing we're really focusing on for the organizing is getting everyone in Washington, not just like the people who are super excited about housing in Seattle behind this. I feel like I'm a really great test to this because I am just now getting initiated into like the city planning world. Like, I come from a background of working mostly on environmental issues. And so I grew up on a farm. I've only lived in Seattle for 2 years. So I think connecting with folks who share rural backgrounds and understanding why do they care about middle housing, when they have a farm, and understanding that, rural people do care about this just as much. Urban sprawl is very real. Folks in Skagit County don't want these FCCs, these huge communities, sucking up resources and destroying the green spaces around them. So I think finding those different connections, how can a young person in Seattle connect with, a retiree in rural Washington? And, even beyond just rural versus urban landscapes of, okay, well, labor is behind this. We've got a lot of unions supporting this. Why do they care about it? What's the connection there? And I think the cool thing about housing specifically is everyone does care about it. Everyone has very different reasons about why they care about it. But at the end of the day, you can get anyone fired up about why we need to pass this missing middle bill.
And I think a couple other things just in terms of messaging, because Marcella's hitting it, is I think the good thing about something like the middle housing bill, and she said this, is that it impacts everybody differently. So we do have really good reasons to support it. So if you want to protect farmland, support infill development. If you want to lower infrastructure costs because you don't want to see your taxes raised, support infill development. If you want transportation infrastructure to work better and be able to get access to more transit, walkable neighborhoods and stuff like that, support infill development. The most amazing thing about the bills that we're talking about this year, as Marcella mentioned, is they touch every single asset or facet of our lives, and moving those forward and finding out which one each person cares about, we can do that. And to me, this housing thing is, we, as you mentioned, have so focused on neighborhood character, but a building doesn't create neighborhood character. The people in it do, and what their needs are, and making sure we're meeting those. And really, we want to hear the stories about why people care about their farm, or why they care about lowering their infrastructure costs, or any of these things, right? They're all there. And housing is the one thing that you can point at and says, it impacts vehicle miles traveled, it impacts energy resources, it impacts greenhouse gases, it impacts how I get to work, or when I get to work, how long my commute is. It's just amazing. It's the one thing that you can find a way to connect it to everybody's life in a way no one, we don't really with every other piece of legislation.
Yeah, great points, both of you, and especially the not many issues bring together both the Chamber of Commerce and the Seattle Metropolitan Chamber of Commerce is a big supporter, and also the labor councils, the Washington State labor councils put out a statement very supportive of the statewide zoning approach. So that's unique. I see that. But one thing I wanted to kind of touch upon a little more too is there's a lot of problems that kind of get painted as Seattle only or King County only, and as you both were talking about, this isn't really one of those. And as we saw, politically, that strategy didn't really work that well this past session or this past election, where Seattle is the boogeyman and we all have different problems. That those kind of candidates didn't do well, and the Republican Party didn't do well picking up those suburban seats. So that's my own little political aside. But Marcella, I was curious, since you did grow up in a rural area. I know it's maybe not hitting every part of the state quite as much, but I know having traveled around, there are really big worries in lots of parts of the state, since we have such a we have a good tourism industry, and a lot of people from Seattle go do their weekends and places like Leavenworth, or places on the coast, and those places are struggling with high housing costs, partially from people getting that second home or moving there and working remotely. So has that been an issue that's increasingly coming in the fold in those communities?
Yeah, definitely. I am actually in Spokane right now. I don't know if you can tell I'm in a hotel room, but that housing has become a huge issue in Spokane. In places like Bellingham and Spokane, the costs of housing have risen faster than Seattle in the past few years, just partially because a lot of folks during the pandemic left Seattle and went to these cheaper areas. And the mentality in Spokane specifically is, okay, we need to tackle missing middle housing just so we don't become Seattle. So, it is that balance of, okay, we don't want Seattle to be the boogeyman with this issue, but other communities are looking at Seattle saying, we don't want to have a housing crisis that severe. So what can we do now? So there is a lot of support around that. I've seen a lot, I've just mentioned it, but a lot of support in Skagit County around, creating these FCC communities, which are essentially constructed man-made towns that the counties would have to, fund resources like fire department. And a lot of residents are not a fan of this. I'd say the majority of people do not want this. It'll be destroying rural lands and green spaces. So different narratives, I think, are important to the different regions, but the gist is we are in rural Washington because we want to be in a rural place. We don't want to become these really big urban spaces, and we don't want to have the problems that places like Seattle are having. So what can we do? Missing middle sounds great. Let's start there.
Yeah, and Spokane was really a trailblazer in that front, because earlier this year they just said, all right, we're in a kind of emergency situation here. Why don't we just try this as a pilot legislation? And they just did it. And cities like Seattle have been talking about doing it, citywide for a decade, but Spokane showed that you can try things. You don't have to have a 5-year process for everything. They could always change their mind and repeal the pilot, but it's interesting to see. And I Spokane showed great leadership on that front of, as far as, okay, if you call it a crisis, you can't really have a 5 to 10 year process for that. That's not crisis kind of response. So kudos to Spokane for that. We do have some audience questions to get to. So why don't we pivot over to that? Here's a nice hopeful one. And if your answer is the statewide zoning bill. Give us your second, but someone asked what are you most optimistic for this session? Whether that's a bill or something else, but do either you have something for that in mind?
I mean, I'm gonna, obviously the state, I think that I am, and it kind of encompasses everything, and I do apologize for that, but I am extremely optimistic that we're going to, at a minimum, see some of the most transformative housing policy coming out of Washington. There's momentum in a way. This includes the middle housing bill, but this, along with things like the middle housing bill that we didn't necessarily touch on, are things like changing parking minimums and getting rid of a lot of those. There's momentum. People talking about like, if you get rid of parking minimums, it doesn't mean a developer might not build parking. It just means that they won't build unnecessary parking, right? Like we can still have a few parking spaces if it's needed. And another one would be around, a lot split bill. The middle housing bill is great, but we need a lot split. We need to make sure that we can do lot splits so they can be sold and people in a fee simple manner as opposed to an HOA or a condo. You can do it either way, but that lot split bill will be key, I think, to really unlocking the long-term affordability for some of these in a way that we haven't seen before. So, I know I'm putting it out there, but I think some of the biggest investments in affordable housing, because we saw the numbers in the central Puget Sound and those are replicated across the state, paired with some of the most impactful changes to restrictions we've had that will hopefully unlock the potential. So that, I know that's kind of like a boring, lame answer, but I can tell you I've never been more excited about or positive about the potential for substantial housing legislation than I do this year.
I think my answer is pretty nerdy in terms of organizing. I'm very optimistic about the future of organizing now that, like we're still in the pandemic, but it's not as severe. We aren't like locked down as we were before. But I think coming out of the pandemic, like people know how to use Zoom. We have like online organizing tactics. Like we know how to get people in Spokane and Bellingham to like talk to legislators in Olympia without them having to, get the day off of work. But this year we can start doing in-person events again. Like we did some petitioning in person in Seattle last week. So as an organizer, I am so excited for this mix of we can do it all this session. Whatever folks are comfortable with, we can do it. So the potential for people getting involved, I think this is like an all-time high.
That is really good to hear. And that's a good point about starting out. We're having skills to both do virtual and start doing in person too. We can get the best of both worlds, hopefully. So I really hope that works out well. Another question we had, and we have some pretty specific questions, but I'm curious, you might just know the answer to these, Bryce or Marcella. One, and I think we kind of touched on this, but just to kind of draw it out, one person asked, how likely is it we'll see zoning reform passed at the state level this session that will address that local governments have been actively opposing the growth, except next to like state highways, and they mentioned Linwood and Edmonds, or expanding EGA to do that potentially. So do you think the bills will be able to sort of zero in on those particular issues? And I know that has been a concern as far as quality of life. If is our apartments going to be relegated to very near highways?
I gave a presentation on December 2nd in front of the House Local Government Committee, along with Carl Schrader, who works for AWC. And, they talked a lot about missing middle around arterials. The first thing that I said is, why are we consigning them to the same places that we know have safety hazards? We have the highest incidence right now of pedestrians and cyclists being hit across the state. Seattle, it's really sad in Seattle, and thanks to the Urbanist work for highlighting that every day. I will say that it's because of you that I know how much worse it is. We shouldn't be concentrating everything on these places that are unsafe to walk or bike on. We shouldn't be concentrating them only where air quality is poor. The reason why people want the reason why they limit it to those areas is because they like what being 3 blocks off of an arterial provides you, and that's why everybody should have that opportunity. I would say that, the TOD bill will be kind of node centric and line centric, so there'll be a little bit of grouping on that one. That's just how it's going to work. But I think for the missing middle bill, I don't think that we're going to be willing to limit it to areas that just are not the safest and most healthy areas. We need them everywhere, and addressing, I think the core concern is addressing those 2 issues, right? We have jurisdictions that are doing a good job. Like I just heard back from the city of Burien, who was like, this is the missing middle outline bill that you just sent us is fantastic. We support it. We need a couple of tweaks just to make sure we can implement it, but let's do it. That's the same with Bothell and Kirkland and some of these other places. They want to do it. And I think that we, kind of going back to it, is our goal is to undercut that, because if we continue to give local control, we're going to end up with the same outcomes we've had for the last 50 years, and those haven't worked. So why are we allowing them to continue to do it? So fundamentally, what are the chances that we're going to limit it? If we keep the momentum going pretty good, again, a bunch of us are organizing cities that want to see this done because it makes it easier for them, then I think we've got a good shot at making sure that we're not falling victim to limitations.
And another technical question, and this one is pretty wonky too. So this has, a little bit of cart ahead of the horse, but asking about when these bills will go into effect, and they're specifically curious about whether they'll be subject to the new efficiency rules that the State Building Council passed this November. I was curious if you had waded into that. If that's a little bit too into the weeds, we can skip that one, but I figured you might know.
So in terms of implementation timelines, we're doing our best just to make it happen with the comprehensive plan update cycle, because they have to do so much of the work anyway, and we want to save resources. In relation to how the building code council stuff goes, I don't know enough about that. I know that they updated them. I know that there's some concern about upfront costs, but I also know, the long-term operating costs, I don't like to call it that, but like the long-term costs of heating and cooling and stuff like that in my house, my new townhome construction is significantly lower than the townhome I lived in even 5 years ago, right? Like it's just amazing. So I don't know about the timing for the building code stuff. And I don't know enough detail to speak on that one, but I would say that at this point, our idea is, the Central Puget Sound and everybody else update them as best they can with their comprehensive plans. And if something happens, there's some oversight in terms of how quickly they're required to do them. But hopefully within 2 to 3 years, when we look at, bill passage and everything else, over the next 3 years, we should see pretty much full implementation of a middle housing bill in TOD.
Awesome. And relatedly, I also have heard that Representative Dewar is working on a bill that sort of would shield sixplexes from having to go into the International Building Code, because that sort of creates a headache for developers. It's a little more complicated code than what single family homes face. So I think it's currently at 4plexes. I think your carve out would maybe go to 6plexes, maybe higher. I'm not exactly sure, but have you followed that bill? You think that one would dovetail nicely? Is it maybe have a path?
Yeah, so I think the good thing, and kind of going back to some of the, what I was excited about, this is the first time that I'm seeing people think about, if we pass one bill, what does it mean for the actual on the ground implementation, and will that on the ground implementation work? So things like Representative Dewar looking at, what are the design standards for 4plexes versus 6plexes, is key to making sure this can work. Again, looking at it from an affordable housing lens, if we have that extra duplex or an extra 2 units per lot, and we can reduce costs for affordable housing developers for home ownership opportunities. Talk about making sure you're getting the most out of your changes. Again, it goes with the lot split bill and everything else. This is the first time I've seen a coordinated effort to look at, if we change this policy, what's the next policy that could potentially impact the development of these? And after that, what's the next policy? So yeah, Representative Dewars is really exciting to see. I think it has a lot of conversation to happen, but I still think it's a good idea, just generally speaking, because we're talking, a lot of these are going to be wood frame, right? We're not talking tall buildings that are really multifamily. You know, we're talking row houses that could be 6 and they're not on top of each other, they're next to each other. Why are we doing certain things when it's essentially a 4,000 square foot single family home, right? It's what it is. There's no difference in construction requirements. So I think it's pretty interesting, and I'm hopeful for that bill too.
Yeah, we love to see that because as we've seen with some of these cities who have passed fourplexes, if there's enough other things happening with their land use code or with their permitting process, it's all on paper and there's only a small trickle of housing. But obviously, as we've connected this to the housing crisis, the hope is that this will be a fix for the housing crisis, and in concert with other things, obviously, like the major investment in affordable housing we mentioned at the state level as well. But we want this to be buildable, and it's great to see legislators thinking in that front end. Representative Dewar is great on that. So kudos to her. A little bit of a pivot, but I don't know if you follow this stuff closely since it's sort of out of your Futurewise wheelhouse, but we got a question about new support for small businesses that continue to be affected by pandemic, supply chain, inflation pressures. Have you heard of any of thing along those lines cooking at the state legislature?
No, I haven't. You're right. It's a little bit outside of my bandwidth. I know that they've kind of changed up again some of the committees, so I think it'd be of interest for people to check those out when they come out from the House. And the Senate released theirs a couple weeks ago. So no, I don't know extensively, but I do know that there's new folks on each committee that are going to be addressing those issues, and some new chairs, just because we've been playing musical chairs because everybody's moving around. So I think, I know that that's a big deal for members, but yeah, I'm just not in those. I wish I could give you a better answer.
And we're almost out of time here, but I did want to ask about revenue, because oftentimes that's sometimes if you want to invest in things like infrastructure and housing, where are you going to get the money? That's a big question. And I know that the Supreme Court sort of working their way through this ruling on capital gains, and they didn't block it. It's allowed to be collected, so it's sort of so far so good. But have you heard I don't know if that ruling is going to come out in time, but are they hoping to do more progressive tax reform, or is that kind of blocked by that ruling, not knowing whether or not they're going to have the green light to kind of do a progressive, whether it's wealth tax or however you want to cut that income tax?
Yeah, the ruling was so interesting because they were able to continue to move forward with the rulemaking, and I think the hope is that they get a little bit more information, or that the ruling comes out kind of before they fully start collecting it. But that's weird timelines, and you know more about it than I do. I just remember reading about it's really just, anyway, it doesn't matter. Yes, I think I have been hearing good things. I would say one of the big significant things is seeing Representative Frame become Senator Frame. She has led some of the biggest conversations, in the House on progressive revenue. She's been a leader on addressing our tax issues, and her voice being in the Senate, where sometimes it's a little bit harder to move some of these bigger tax issues, I think it's really going to help shift the conversation. The House, I think, has historically been a little bit more ready to address the issues of taxation and making sure that progressive taxes are moved forward than maybe the Senate has. So I do see a lot of conversations happening. And for those that follow, she did just go visit the White House and have a conversation on housing and progressive revenue. So I know she's ready to bring that back to the legislature, because she's been leaning on it for so long. So I don't know, maybe necessarily to the extent. I don't think, maybe the ruling might have a small chilling effect, but with everything and the revenues that we're talking about and fixing it, fixing our tax code so the least among us aren't paying the most of our income, most of their income every day, is fundamental to creating a just society. So I'm hopeful, and every indication shows that they want to keep addressing it. Even if maybe something big doesn't pass, I think they set themselves up for good outcomes in a year or two.
Yeah, that is good. And that's a good point about having a new champion in the Senate with Noel Fran going over there. So that is going to be huge, and it will kind of change the dynamic a little bit. So okay, if you allow me to go over a little bit, we got one last question coming under the wire. And it's good because we haven't talked about transportation yet. We did just pass a huge transportation bill last session, which sort of built on existing sources, but it made a lot of investments existing with the carbon tax added. But so we had a question: what's the most likely transportation policies in terms of revenue or otherwise that'll move this session? Is that going to kind of be a focus? I saw that committee really got moved around a little bit, and Senator Wynn's no longer on there, for example. So some different faces.
Yeah, I'm going to quickly put on my transportation choices hat, because for folks who don't know, I represent TCC as well as the contract lobbyist for them, as well as Futurewise. So kind of have some insight there. Yeah, both the House and the Senate made some changes. Obviously, the chairs stayed. Representative Fye is the chair of the House. Senator Elias is going to continue to chair the Senate. Senator Saldana and Senator Wynn moved off the Transportation Committee. Those are big losses, but I think that when you look at some of the investments we made last year, it was because of the hard work they did, and they wanted a new challenge, because they solved at least they didn't solve the problem, but they know they started making a dent in it, and it's moving in the right direction. So I think the big transportation policies folks should watch out for are going to be around safety. As I mentioned before, people are speeding. There's a lot less people following, just general rules of the road. And again, I mentioned the crashes and the pedestrian injuries and deaths, along with bicycle injuries and deaths, has really changed the focus, I think, and brought a new light that maybe people have been ignoring because it didn't seem front and center, and now it does. For folks who don't know, Highway 7 through Tacoma had a 13-year-old kid die when he was biking across in a marked crosswalk with the lights flashing, and someone decided to, get into the second lane and speed around somebody who was slowing down because it was going to waste their time. And a poor 13-year-old died. And then another person just got injured on Highway 7 in Tacoma. And that resulted in the governor going down to Tacoma and really trying to figure out what can we do to address these things. And, I give him a lot of credit because he's really forcing a conversation in ways that we don't know. So first off, safety is going to be number one in policy world for transportation. There's conversations around, speed cameras and construction zones for highways and other places where there has been some pretty bad wrecks. For those who might have followed the highway I-5 expansion and Highway 16, there was a number of trucks that tipped over when they were going 65 and what was a 50, and they're trying to address those issues. There's going to be, speaking about the 1099 climate bill, there's going to be potential amendments around level of service for transportation and completely moving away from car-centric level of service planning and focusing on safety and just making sure your transportation options are safe. And that's the number one priority. That's going to be a big lift to add to the climate bill, but I think we have a chance because the centering of those issues. There is going to be, TCC is running a bill with Senator Saldana on, removing jaywalking laws, those old historical things that were meant to, both target certain individuals, but also, kind of help create our car supremacy. TCC is working with Senator Saldana on running a bill to overturn those. So unless you're causing, an immediate danger to yourself or vehicles, you shouldn't be cited. You shouldn't be stopped. People know how to cross the street in a safe manner. And even when they do cross it in what's supposed to be a safe manner, the drivers don't care and they're still hitting other people. So, that's going to be a big one out there. And I would look to Senator Elias and see 2 or 3 other major pieces of safety legislation just around trying to figure out how we slow vehicles down with the eye on long-term moving away from enforcement. And, no new revenue this year for transportation, but I want to say that, the building blocks of looking at how we invest in our infrastructure and what that infrastructure looks like is going to be a thing that we might not see a bill on, but we'll start seeing changes in both budgetary issues and other areas as well.
That is really good to hear. And yeah, we really have been following that safety crisis closely, especially our lead transportation reporter, Ryan Packer. They kind of keep a Seattle ticker, but it's a good reminder that Tacoma has a huge, crisis around this as well. And we'd love the focus, and the state, kind of break some context into here. The state has made a 2030, end all traffic collisions pledge, as well as like cities like Seattle and I believe Bellevue and others have done. But unfortunately, we saw, pedestrian collisions are on the upward trend rather than downward. So that's not a good sign when we're only about 8 years away from hitting that sort of goal date. And, any progress we can make towards zero would be awesome. So we'll continue to follow that during the session. Thanks so much for putting your TCC hat there. And we are big supporters of ending that jaywalking bill as well, since it's been definitely used in racially disproportionate way. So I'm happy to sign on to that bill. And thanks for joining us, making time on this wintry evening. And we'll put this video up and share the link for your week of action. But we're very optimistic as well about going into this session.
Thank you. Thanks for hosting. Thanks for having us. Thanks for all the support you guys have provided.
Yeah, thanks so much. Hope to see y'all at the other week of action events.
Awesome. Thanks, Marcella.